Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. Rabbi Ken Spiro from Israel. Welcome back.
To be back after a long hiatus here. We had a big break. I was in America for three
Yeah.
weeks.
And it's like literally a different world that we're living in. After 3 weeks, the entire Middle East has been reorganized. The axis of evil has been brought to its knees. It's a really fast state of history that we're living through. So yeah, I would love to anything that we should know about your tour in North America, anything you want to say about what's going on now, and then we'll dig into our subject for today.
No, the tour was much more intense touring in North America earlier in the year when, things were fresh. People have kind of gotten into a rhythm and like and with what's happened in the Middle East with Hamas, winding down of the hostage, unfortunately, are still were accounted for a good number of them. But what happened with Hezbollah, and these people are a little more, I would say, a little more at ease with Israel and looking forward to normalcy returning. But on the other hand, I do notice that there is still a lot of incidents of anti-Semitism in North America. I mean, and around the world in general. You had in Canada, you had some serious incidents, and I think people are more relaxed about Israel and more less relaxed about the domestic situation at home,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
I don't think is
If
going to change
anyone
that. Yeah.
hasn't seen it yet, there was a great article that just not a great but difficult article that just came out on the Free Press, written which is run by Barry Weiss, but basically talking about anti-Semitism in Canada, and it's a harrowing state of affairs. And as I've said to anyone who's read it, it's true times 100. It's worse than you think. So it's a really, really interesting time to be living in the diaspora right now. But let's move our focus to the Middle East, where, wow, what is going on over there? In terms of Syria, we very specifically today wanted to dig into what is Syria? What does this mean that it's fallen? What is the history of that part of the Middle East? And help us get a sense of how we're relating to it, both as Jews, as Israelis, as, what's going to happen there. So can you give us a bit of background? Where should we start?
Yeah, so I think, Ellie, it's a good place to start. I love to do with my students. I call it big history. Like you pointed out, when we are talking about what to talk about, that every pundit is jumping in here and commenting on what's going on now. So there's like overload on the current situation and who the players are and how's it going to play out and what does it mean for this, that, and the other thing. But not a lot of people are talking about the depth of the relationship, the history of the Middle East. All of these things are factored into, it's kind of like jumping to the last show in a 10-part series on a TV show. And okay, it's got a lot of action going on, but you really lack the context. We got to do some like previous episode stuff here. And I like doing with students in general what's called big history to understand how other factors besides the personalities, the technology, play a role in history, like geography, economics. These play huge roles when where you live in the world. The climate, for instance, is it a temperate climate? Is it a climate that you have to work like crazy half the year, or you freeze to death and starve in the winter because you didn't do enough farming? That affects how a society develops. That kind of thing. Trade routes, it's all related. And in terms of a little bit of big history, because while a lot of stuff has changed in the Middle East in the last 3,500 years, certain things have not changed. One is the geography, which is super important to understand. And I know it's well worth everyone like taking out a map and looking at what we're talking about in the Middle East, because people have vague ideas of, if I took a map of the Middle East with no country names on it and showed it to people, I doubt most people could point out any of the countries there. Maybe Jews could point out Israel, and they know what countries are around Israel. But if you look at where Israel is, first of all, civilization in the Western world begins in where we are in Israel, in the Middle East. It's called the Fertile Crescent, which, depending upon which historian you ask, basically is an arc that runs from, if you look at the Persian Gulf, in the middle you have this big lump called basically Saudi Arabia, the Hijaz, and in the south of that you have the Red Sea, and to the north and to the east of that you have the Persian Gulf. But civilization and the top of the Persian Gulf is today a country called Iraq, which has two rivers running out of it, which are called the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But that arc, that crescent, so to speak, like a crescent moon, really begins and curves around over the top, going through what is from it today, what is Iraq, through Syria, Lebanon's included, but Lebanon's a teeny little country there, through Jordan, Iraq, Israel, and then into the top of Egypt for sure, according to most authorities. But it's like a half shade, a moon, crescent moon that goes through there, and Israel is sandwiched between these countries, which today are countries that we call Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, but in the ancient world, it was primarily to the south, Egypt, which is the oldest continuous civilization in the ancient world. It survived for I think over 3,000 years. Egypt exists more when you get to the end of Egypt, only conquered, by the way, maybe 3 or 4 times. Remarkably stable civilization, precisely because it's surrounded by a desert, great natural defenses, and no one's migrating in from the west of Egypt. Whereas the area that concerns us today, where all this action is happening, which is basically Syria, and Syria and Iraq are really part of one geographic area, has these two rivers running through. Specifically, the Euphrates runs through. The top of the Euphrates runs through Syria, but this is a large fertile floodplain which has no natural defenses, and it's a very desirable piece of land, especially in the ancient world, which was agrarian, meaning built on agriculture and not industry. And also, it's a land bridge. Israel has the same role. A land bridge is a piece of land that acts as a bridge, in this case, connecting continents or parts of the world. What Israel connects is Africa to the rest of the world, literally. The anthropological story of the migration of hominids out of Africa through the rest of the world. They worked their way up from the southern part of Africa and all the way into Europe through Israel, and where Syria, Iraq sits today is basically the piece of land. If you look on a map, that's the connector between Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, which is actually based on a French word, which is the land to the east of the Mediterranean, which includes all the countries we mentioned before, like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Israel and all that. And then everything Asia Minor, which is basically Turkey and the rest of the world, which is very important because, trading is such a big thing. The Silk Road, which brought all the spices and everything from the Far East for so many, many centuries, runs right through the area of what is basically Iran and Iraq, and it goes out to the Mediterranean. The frankincense route that brought that very valuable commodity from what is Yemen of today goes up the coast of Saudi Arabia to Gaza and through Israel. So we're sitting right in the middle of what is not only strategically a very important part of the world, but also the earliest great civilizations. And what's the measure of civilization? People think today, cities and theater and Wi-Fi and electric vehicles, but civilization comes out of when animals go from being hunted to being grown in herds of animals, and vegetables and crops can be harvested in fields as opposed to like hunter-gathering stuff. Then not everyone is spending their whole life looking for food. So you end up getting a surplus of food, increase in health and life expectancy, a growth in population, a stratification of society. And you have not everyone's a farmer. You have priests and you have artisans and you have soldiers and you have all kinds of things coming out of it. And then you get culture and innovation. And so the earliest civilizations in the world, this part of the world, I know it's hard to imagine today because these are parts of the world, when we look back, are steeped in violence and very largely backward compared to much of the Western world, which kind of took off and passed that part of the world. But back then, this was really the center of culture. Like writing, for instance, begins, at the bottom, Sumer, Ur, down at the bottom of where Abraham comes out of, is at that top of the Persian Gulf in what is today Iraq. So that's an important thing to understand, that today we don't look at the Middle East conflict as being a central conflict. We look at it as being sort of a sideshow proxy war thing going on between bigger powers, duking it out over influence. And we think of the Middle East as primarily, first and foremost, oil, as carbon fuel power. That's the big power and the big influence the Middle East has on the world, and maybe the Suez Canal for shipping. But it used to be the other way around. So it's not only the earliest great civilization, the earliest writing, but in many ways the center of the world. So a lot of early civilizations begin there, and that is where the history of the people who today occupy Syria, some of them begin there. A lot of them come from the Arab world, which is the Arabian Peninsula, not exactly the same place. But
yeah,
Abraham.
What was Syria in the ancient world? Was there a country named Syria? Were there people who I think we know the name Assyrians? Is that the same thing? Like, how does that relate? Like, what are we looking at? If we were to look at a map 2,000 years ago. Was Syria on it?
No, no. See, that's the thing. Then the modern nation state construct didn't hold for the vast majority of the world until relatively modern times. Europe tend to evolve it a little earlier, but even countries in Europe like Italy and France didn't evolve into nation states until the late 19th century. But the Middle East is totally not based on that. What you have in the Middle East are two things. You have clans and tribes, and you have empires. And there is no country of Syria. If we go back to the earliest, and the history goes back thousands of years before, if we go to the story of Abraham, and Abraham's going back to the Middle Bronze period. So we're talking about 3,700 years ago, the late Middle Bronze era. So there already is, he's come and he's emerging from what are some of the earliest civilizations at the bottom of the Tigris and Euphrates River. But the earliest inhabitants there, these Assyrians, Arameans is a name you hear. These are the Semitic peoples, and Semitic means it's used to kind of define the word anti-Semitism refers specifically to Jews, but Semitic means basically, anthropologically speaking, peoples whose origins are in that part of the world. That's basically the Levant, that Eastern Mediterranean area. So the Arameans, for instance, in the Passover Haggadah, we say an Aramean tried to like get rid of my father, talking about Jacob. We're talking about Lavan, his father-in-law. So there are ancient peoples who identify as Semitic peoples going back well over 1,000 years before the Common Era. I mean, Abraham is 1,700 years before the Common Era. But the first empires, in terms of civilizations emerging that we're more familiar with, are when you get to and then with the birth of a Jewish state in the land of Israel going back 3,300 years ago, Israel is sandwiched in between what's called the Assyrian Empire. And that's Assyrian and Syria are used interchangeably. It's not exactly the same thing. The Assyrians are an empire, and I should have included like a PowerPoint to show people different maps of what their empires look like. But all these empires, the difference between what happened with Egypt in the south, which is one empire, which is only overrun 3, possibly 4 times, with different old, middle, and new kingdoms, but it's Egyptian people until the Greeks finally, in the 4th century before the Common Era, conquer it permanently, and then it ceases to exist as an identifiable ancient Egypt. But in this area of the world, which is called Mesopotamia, was what you're referring to, which is the Greek word for the land between the two rivers, there's going to be multiple empires that will appear there. The earliest one, and the one that's on our radar in terms of ancient history of Israel, as opposed to the modern state of Syria on our radar very much today, where Israeli soldiers are in their country now, is the Assyrian Empire. And these are people who are Western Semitic people that are based in the area of what we would call, if you look at a map today, based in the area of what is primarily Iraq and Syria and part of Iran. On the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, everyone is fighting for that piece of turf because it's this very fertile floodplain with no natural defenses. So, the history of all empires is they emerge, they wax, and then they wane, and they're overrun by empires that come after them. So that would be like you have other peoples in that area: Amorites, Hittites. Hittites are Eastern Semitic people, more from Asia Minor, which is the area of Turkey of today. So there's a mushmash of people there, but there's no country called Syria in the ancient world.
I think I was listening to something, I believe it was maybe Jonathan Schanzer that was talking about this in terms of really we keep trying to, what was imposed on the Middle East, after the First World War, I think it was this idea that you could have countries. Like the Middle East was very pre-national, meaning it wasn't a place that was divided into national countries where everybody in the country got together and were like, we're a country because we all live under the same laws, the same ideas, the same values, the same principles. It was imposed upon them. But the difficulty was, and especially in Syria, like these were tribes that are Sunni and Shiite and Christian and have all these weird backgrounds, and you're kind of trying to shove them together and saying you're now a country and now you all have to get along and support each other. Whereas it seems like what you're saying is in the past there wasn't these national aspirations. This was just simply a large piece of land where lots of different tribes and peoples lived, and they often didn't share the same values and principles. Is that accurate?
Definitely. Again, we talk about an empire. I mean, empires are comprised of a group of people. Like when you have Assyrians, when you have Babylonians, these are groups of people. These are actually, they're not just, it's like America's a mishmash. So no, there's no one ethnicity in the United States. So you actually had groups of people who were descended from one common ancestry and had common genetic and linguistic connections to each other. And these empires would expand and then end up ruling over other tribes, clans, or previous empires of people. But the nationalist construct that you're talking about is, again, a new construct and that emerges out primarily of modern European history. The traditional way, where you go to Asia, wherever you go in the world, the more, so to speak, primitive the world is, you have tribes and clans and smaller societies that are often made up of small groups of people living in forests or whatever, scattered around areas that would merge. The whole history of the emergence of empires is someone just accumulating more land, more money, more power, and then larger military forces and subsuming other groups of people in. So you do get an idea of world powers in the ancient world, like the Roman Empire, which controlled the entire Mediterranean for half a millennia and ruled over many different groups of people. But this was just a military and a colonial control of a foreign people. It wasn't the idea of a national identity. When you're a citizen, you have rights, and you have a nationalist identity, and your primary identity. That's the real essence of what nationalism is about. Is my primary identity is I'm part of a nation state. I have loyalty to a country and a flag, and that idea does not exist. But it's not just a bunch of clans and tribes. You have large, very powerful empires appearing in the world at this time. And again, they expand into other people's territory, but there's no idea of, people becoming naturalized Babylonian citizens or something like that, or Assyrian citizens. But a lot of different people are going to migrate into this area. You have the Amorites, you have Hittites, you're going to have Phoenicians, who are a seafaring people. They're considered part of the Canaanite peoples. They end up living on the coast of what is today Lebanon and places like Tyre and Sidon, and end up colonizing even North Africa. So there's a mishmash of people. But to follow through, like the little chronology, because there's so much detail here and we can get lost in it, is going back. If you get to the period of time of the First Temple period of the Jewish people in Israel, which is about 2,800 years ago, the first major empire that is in the area of what we today would call Iraq and Syria and is the Assyrian Empire. And that empire is you can see it. They're the ones who subjugate the northern and southern kingdoms of the Jewish people. This is after the death of King Solomon, and Israel splits into two countries, so to speak. 10 tribes in the north called Israel, and a tribe in the south called Judah. And Israel's sandwiched between the Egyptian Empire in the south and various empires, beginning with the Assyrian Empire in the north, centered in what is today the area of Iraq. And these battles take place in the land of Israel between these two empires. And there's a lot of stories in the Bible of these empires invading the land of Israel, or Israel making an alliance with the Egyptians against the Assyrian Empire. But if we go back to, let's say, 2,600 years ago, then a new empire emerges more or less in the same place, which is called the Babylonian Empire. So none of this has to do with Syria yet. And none of these has to do with, there's no Islam yet. The Jewish people around were the only monotheistic faith at this time. So you get to the Babylonian Empire, and again, these are the people who subjugate. Israel becomes first a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire, and then we get inherited as the vassal state of the Babylonian Empire, which means we live under their control. And in the case of both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, the northern and southern kingdoms rebel, and these armies invade Israel. In the case of the northern kingdom, going back about 2,600 years ago, they will destroy the northern kingdom, the Assyrian Empire, and exile the Jews to the east, to Chala and Habor and the Gozan River, and that creates that great mystery called the 10 Lost Tribes. So that takes place while we are under the control, domination, and subjugation of that empire. Then they're swallowed up by the Babylonian Empire. And then it's the Babylonian Empire, which will be the major world power, again, based in the area of what we would call primarily Iraq and Syria of today. And they will exert their hegemony all the way down, by the way, into Egypt. And going back 2,500 years ago, in the late First Temple period, we rebel against them, and they destroy Jerusalem and exile us and carry us away into captivity in Babylon. So we end up, ironically, back sort of where we came from, because if we rewind to the beginning of our story, Abraham begins at the bottom of the Euphrates River by the Persian Gulf, and he migrates up through exactly all this territory through the Tigris and Euphrates area into Haran, which is in Turkey, which is in Asia Minor, which is the eastern side of all these empires, and then down into Israel. So all of the action that takes place in the Bible is taking place with us interacting with different empires that are based in what is called Mesopotamia, that land between the two rivers, but there's no state of Syria yet. So the last empire to throw into the picture to make some sense out of it is the Persian Empire. And there's different permutations of the Persian Empire earlier and later, but the Persians overrun the Babylonian Empire. This is when the Jews are still in exile in Babylon for 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. And it's Cyrus the Mede, it's a Median Persian alliance that overthrows Babylon that tells the Jews they can go home back to the land of Israel. And it's during that period of time, by the way, when the Purim story takes place. So our relationship with our friend in the north there, although it has nothing to do with the modern country of Syria, is goes back literally throughout pretty much the entire history of the Jewish people is connected to that piece of real estate.
So
Way before there's any modern states.
So wait, what year was that around where we were told to go back to our own homeland? Like where are we in history there?
About 2,500 years ago, about halfway through the first millennia before the Common Era.
Got it.
I mean, Jewish chronology.
Is there a connection between the name? Like what does Assyrian mean, and what does Syria mean? Do we know anything about what those names mean and where they came from?
Yeah, Assyrian is an Anglicized version of Ashur. So the origins of Ashur, I'm not sure linguistically where it comes from, but that's the English version of the word. So that's something I have to look up and see linguistically what it actually comes from. So because all the words we're using, Babylonian and Assyrian and all this, and Mesopotamian, Mesopotamian is a Greek word, but the original words, the language, by the way, of all these peoples are very closely, the alphabet and the language is extremely closely related to Hebrew. It's Aramaic, which is the script we use in Hebrew today. Just to show you the influence is so great. The months that we use in the Bible doesn't give months names. It gives them the first month, the second month, the third month, the fourth month. And the months we use today, Nisan, Sivan, Tishrei, those are the names we brought back with us from living in what is basically the area of Iraq, Syria for 70 years in exile. And even when we're allowed to go home, that's the first diaspora community that's created. I mean, Jews living outside of Israel is the Babylonian Jewish community, which will morph into the Iraqi Jewish community, which, by the way, now it doesn't exist anymore because the Jews were ethnically cleansed from the Middle East between 48 and 1948 and 67. But that community predates any Arab arrival in that part of the world by like 1,000 years. So this is I guess
that's what I have a question about too. I think when we think about the history of the ancient Middle East, we imagine that all of it was Arab. And other than the Arabs, it was just Jews. But so what kind, you're saying Semitic peoples, what's the difference between a Semitic person and an Arab?
Right. So Semitic is kind of a generic term that refers to anyone in the Middle East. It can be used very, very broadly. But linguistically, we talk about Western and Eastern Semitic languages, depending on where they are. The Eastern ones being more into what is called Asia Minor, the area of Turkey, like Hittite, for instance. Whereas Arabic and Hebrew are Western Semitic languages. Aramaic is a Western Semitic language. And they're very, very similar. If you know Aramaic, it's close enough to Hebrew, you can get a lot of it, but just far enough away that it's frustrating when the language we say the Kaddish prayer in it, Iskadal V'Iskadash Shmei Rabbah, is Aramaic. Ba'alma, ba'olamo in Hebrew, ba'alma in his world, that kind of thing. So we bring back a lot of the influence with us into the land of Israel, and the cultural influence of that part of the world, which today is Iraq, Syria, will be the main culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. Linguistically, the spoken language of the lingua franca of the Near East will be Aramaic. And the Persian Empire will be a very dominant, very strong empire. They're the ones who invade Greece. We're talking about going back 2,400 years ago. This is during the time when, this is parallel to what's going on in Jewish history in the Second Temple period when the Jews have already returned. And this brings us to the convergence of Western civilization coming to the Middle East. And this is where everything changes. 2,300 years ago, in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great, remember, the Persians tried to take over Greece and they were stopped. That's the story of Thucydides and Herodotus. The first historical records in the West are Herodotus writing about the wars the Greeks fought with the Persians. That's the famous story of the 300 in the Battle of Thermopylae and the Spartans that they made into that graphic novel movie, The 300, about how the 300 Spartans held off all of Darius's army in But so after the Greeks fight off a Persian invasion, Alexander embarks on the greatest military campaign in human history, where he takes about 45,000 Greeks, crosses the Hellespont, which is the body of water. He basically crosses from Europe to Asia into what is today Turkey, and fights three battles: Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, in which he, greatly outnumbered, trashes the largest army in the world, probably. Unbelievable military story, what he does, like the sheer chutzpah of Alexander the Great. But he brings Western culture into the Middle East. He ends the Persian Empire. He builds multiple cities called Alexandria. This has huge implications. This is a story of Hanukkah, because he detours down in about 333 BCE, and it's way out to the Far East. He gets all the way out to India, by the way, way past what is today the area of what we're talking about now. And after 10 years, his men just like burn out of campaigning. He never lost any battles. He fought something like 20 battles and never lost one. But then he dies at the age of 32 in 323 BCE. But he detours down and he comes to Israel, by the way. He marches through what is today Syria and Lebanon. And he's intercepted by Shimon HaTzadik, according to Jewish tradition, the high priest, on his way to destroy Jerusalem, and he talks him out of doing it. It's a very famous story. But this brings the first time Western culture to the Middle East, and it hybridizes into the language of modern Greek of today, and the Hellenistic culture that will become the dominant culture of the entire Mediterranean. Especially the Eastern Mediterranean will be this hybridization of Middle Eastern culture with Greek culture, which will be the dominant culture even during the Roman Empire. And it's the Greeks, by the way, who first end up using the word Syria. And when Alexander dies, he divides his empire into three kingdoms, three large kingdoms. One is in Greece, one is in Egypt, called the Ptolemaic Greek Empire, where all the kings are named Ptolemy, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, whatever. And in the area of what is today Syria, he sets up what's called the Seleucid Greek Empire. But I think the Greeks are the first people who start using the word Syria as we know it, as a term.
Interesting. This is, by the way, I think it's the time, like if people here are familiar with Pirkei Avot, this is the time where at the very beginning of that tractate of Pirkei Avot, I was just learning this recently. This is where it goes from Shimon HaTzadik to him having a student named Antigonus.
Antigonus, right.
Which is, it's supposed to be as shocking as it sounds, where suddenly you go from a Hebrew name to a Greek name in our own Talmud. So this is around this time, I think, that you're talking about, where you can have somebody who has a Greek name living in the land of Israel who's learning with Shimon HaTzadik, who is the head of the Sanhedrin at the time. So I think that's all sort of around that same period, which sort of places us also in our Jewish Talmud and liturgy, as well as historically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And if you go through the Bible and just look for the references you'll see how many times it pops in, how much is so much interplay in bad ways, but also in good ways. There's so much cultural intermixing, so much of what we have in so much of Judaism is impacted in many, many ways by the cult, not just linguistically, by this culture. But here you have the big switch for the whole Middle East, which you were talking about before in the question you asked, is the European interaction, bringing a completely different language. Like Greek language is not a Semitic language. It's a radically different language. A language, by the way, which the rabbis give tremendous praise to, saying it's the most beautiful of all languages. And the original pure Greek was such a beautiful language. You could actually write a Torah scroll in it. It was considered a kosher Torah scroll, the only other language besides Hebrew. But that's not our topic for today. We'll save that for discussion on Hanukkah. But the Greeks, Israel sandwiched then between two Greek empires, because when Alexander dies, his empire splits and they start fighting amongst each other. The Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids, all of whose kings are named Antiochus. And it's during the reign of Antiochus, I believe the seventh, that the Hanukkah story takes place. So Israel's kind of sandwiched as the border between two warring Greek kingdoms. And we have the Hanukkah story, which is a 25-year fight. And here we're fighting people. Here, the indigenous population that was there prior to the Greeks is still there. But now you have an overlay of a bureaucracy and an empire that is foreign from Europe. So the armies now are made up of mercenary forces and soldiers from all different backgrounds. And by the way, the Persians, when the Persians fought the Greeks, they had massive numbers of mercenaries in their army. They fielded armies of hundreds of thousands of men. The Persians even had Greek phalanx. The Greeks fought in these phalanx with these very long, 21-foot long spears and long rows. The Persians had their own Greek soldiers fighting Alexander the Great. So they were fighting, everyone was fighting everyone. What you see, Ellie, is
Wow.
it's getting much more mushmashed. Everything's getting more, as more people pour into the area, everything gets diluted, like kind of more and more like what America is, more and more different groups of people. But if we fast forward through that, the next great civilization to appear is, of course, the Roman Empire, which the birth of Rome is 475 BCE, but already by the late third century, in the 200s before the Common Era, Rome has already subsumed Greece. Rome was a colony of Greece, and now Greece is a
Right.
colony of Rome by this point.
Wow.
Rome moves into the Middle East. And by the middle of the first century before the Common Era, Pompey Magnus in the year 64 will take over the Seleucid Greek Empire, which is today what we call Syria and Lebanon, and that whole part. It becomes part of the Roman Empire, and it expands eastward until it bumps up against the Sasanian Persian Empire, which it never able to conquer. So while part of the Persian Empire is subsumed by Greece and later by Rome, there will remain a Persian Empire, which will morph into the Iran of today, which is a very ancient people. The Iranians are one of the few ancient peoples who are still around in their original homeland, more or less. You don't find a lot of that. Their
But were
language,
they
Farsi,
were they Persians at that time, or were they Iranians? What was
well,
the name that they
Iran.
used?
Well, the Iran. I mean, the two terms are used interchangeably, but the language is Farsi. That they call it in Persian. So I'm not sure when the word Aryan, the term Aryan, comes from Iran, by the way, not from the Germans. Hitler got that one wrong. But as does the
Wow.
swastika, it's a symbol used in the ancient Near East and in India, which he uses for the Nazis.
And
Cultural appropriation.
what's the religion of that era, like at that
Ah, so
time?
the Persian Empire, the Persian Empire brings in Zoroastrianism, which is a dualistic faith that goes back to the first. It goes back to the first millennium before the Common Era. Some people like to claim it's the first monotheistic faith. I hold that is not correct. Judaism predates it, and it's not really monotheistic. It's a whole nother discussion. There's a god of light called Ahura Mazda, and a god of Achikam. There's a god of darkness. It's like a dualistic faith. But it's a very ancient faith, and there's still Zoroastrians around today in the world. That's the
And
predominant religion.
is now that Rome is in what we would know as Syria, is that where it gets renamed Syria Palestina? And again, what's the religious or the cultural makeup of that area at that point in time when Rome is in there?
Right. So now, once the Romans are there, think of any people who've been there already. You got all the people who came before who've been living there. You got the Phoenicians, you got the Hittites, and you got the Persians, you got the Babylonians, and you got everyone, and the Assyrians, and the Arameans, and all these people who have been coming for literally like a millennia and a half. And now we pour into that Greeks, and the Romans keep the term Syria. The term Palestine is not being used at that time yet at all. I'll tell you where that comes in later. But that is a frontline part of the Roman Empire, because the Romans expand dramatically in the next couple hundred years. Pax Romana is a period of time that's covering the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, when they dominate the entire Mediterranean. It's a Roman-controlled sea, which is unbelievable, having got rid of the Carthaginians, who were also Phoenicians, who settled in North Africa and Tunisia, and expanding all the way through. They get to England. They get to like a little south of Scotland. They get up to the Rhine. They get through. But they bump up against the Persians, and they can't go further. They fight many battles, but they never are able to get past them. But it becomes, the Romans will station a lot of soldiers in that part of the world, and it becomes a major center. What we call if there's a tremendous amount, unfortunately, probably a lot of being destroyed. There's a tremendous amount of beautiful Roman antiquities in what we call Syria of today, because the Romans brought with them. You could do a lot worse than living under Roman occupation, especially if you submitted and obeyed the laws and paid your taxes. You got the stability and the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. You got their roads and their culture and their stadiums, their amphitheaters and their theaters and all the things that they had. So there's still today in different places like Palmyra and all these different places you can visit in Syria, which I wouldn't advise visiting now, but there's tremendous remnants of of uh, Roman culture and Roman administrative centers and Roman military presence in that part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which is extremely significant for the Romans because it sits on these trade routes and it's the buffer zone between the ever trying to expand Persian Empire. And a country like Lebanon, which only comes into existence in 1945, is part of Greater Syria, and it has the ports of Tyre and Sidon, which are Phoenician ports. So the major administrative center of the Roman Empire in the east is in what we call Syria of today. So Israel is an important place also, but it's never the administrative center of the Roman Empire. It's further to the east. But with the story of the Palestine comes after the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Jews have rebelled 3 times against the Romans, and the Romans decide to rename the country after the extinct Philistines, who are another ethnic group that migrate across the Aegean way before the Romans and settle on the coast of Israel and the Eastern Mediterranean. So they start calling the whole Eastern Roman Empire, because the Romans divided up their empire into dioceses, Syria, Greater Syria. Judea, before it became Palestine, to wipe the Jewish connection out, was a lower subgroup of what was called Greater Syria. So it had its own procurator, and a high-ranking Roman official was the governor of Judea. And then you had a higher-ranking official, like a proconsul, someone even higher up in stature, who was like the ruler of a larger area of the Roman Empire. That's going to go on until we get to first of all, the Roman Empire splits in the 4th century into the Eastern Roman Empire of Constantinople and the Western Roman Empire in Rome, which disappears by 475 of the Common Era. The Eastern Roman Empire will start having to deal with the emergence of a new faith called Islam in 622.
So actually, I just have a quick question, because I just wanted to clarify in terms of what's happening in the world now. Sure. So I think what you're saying is that the name Syria, Palestine, or Palestine was actually the colonization name that was given to wipe out the indigeneity of Judea and Israel, and to supplant that with Romans. It was actually the name that was given to the land as a part of the empire building and colonization of the Romans of the entire Middle East. Did I get that correct?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. After 3 major revolts, the Romans decided to destroy the Jews religiously and nationalistically, because we're both, by banning Judaism and killing people for practicing Torah like the Greeks tried to do in the Hanukkah story, and by wiping out our connection to the land by renaming what they used to call the province of Judea into Philistia, and by renaming all the cities. Like they renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina after the Roman Emperor Hadrian and the god Jupiter, Capitolina. They renamed Shechem, the city of Shechem, ancient biblical city. Naples, nice Italian name. And since Arabs can't pronounce a P sound, they call it Nablus today. So it's actually funny that Palestinians actually can't say the word Palestine. They have an F though. They have Palestine they can say. But yeah, that's where the name Syro-Palestinian comes in. Greater Syria is so what is the land of Israel just becomes a little province, a suppressed province of the rebellious Jewish people under the hand of the Romans. But that then becomes part of what's the Roman Eastern Empire, which becomes Christian in the 4th century. But if we fast forward, what that's called the Byzantine Empire, and they're based in a place called Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, which is Asia Minor. And that will survive until 1453, when finally the Turks overrun that. But in the 7th century, out of the Arabian Peninsula, because this is the point you were talking about before, Arabs are not indigenous to the Levant. Arabs are indigenous to Arabia. Arabs, people who speak Arabic, okay? They come out of what is the area of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, UAE. That's where they're from, indigenous. And if you look at where Mecca and Medina are, which are the 2 first and second holiest cities, you have to go up the Red Sea on the right side of the Red Sea, the eastern side, which is today Saudi Arabia. And you see where Mecca was an important pagan cultic site and a major rest stop on a very important trade route that brought frankincense from Yemen to the Mediterranean via Gaza, and to Damascus via the route that ran along the coast of Israel. So in the 6th century, Islam expands. 7th century, Islam expands very dramatically. Muhammad dies in 632, the founder of Islam, but the second successor, who is his father-in-law, the second caliph, is Omar ibn al-Khattab. And I believe it's in 634, possibly, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. In 638, Islam comes to Jerusalem and Israel, but a few years earlier, they will take over the Persian Empire and they will set up shop in Damascus. The two most important cities in Syria have traditionally been Aleppo and Damascus. Aleppo is further to the north, away from Israel. Damascus is actually quite close to Israel in the south, near the Golan Heights. But they will take over, and that Islamic empire will actually be based in Damascus, and they will conquer the land of Israel. And now what you have is from then on, for the next 1,300 years until basically the end of World War I, different Islamic, not necessarily Arab dynasties will be controlling different parts of the Middle East. First, it's the Umayyads. Then, by the time it gets to 750, it's the Abbasids and the Ayyub, and then the Fatimids and the Mamluks, the Seljuks, the Ottomans, and they're all based in different places. Some are based in Egypt and Cairo. Some are based in Damascus. Some are based in Istanbul. None of them have a capital in Jerusalem, by the way. But what we see as Syria of today will be ruled by different now. So joining into the ethnic religious mishmash of what was ancient Syria, one of the original foundation cultures of the Near East, now we throw in Arabs and Islam. And that's the big change that will take place. And that will continue all the way on through to you get to the 16th century, when the Ottoman Turks will appear as the great world power. And remember, the Turks are Muslims, but not Arabs. And they're to the north of what is Syria. And they will pretty much make the entire Middle East. By the 16th, 17th centuries, they peak out in their power. They get all the way to the gates of Vienna, Austria, but they're controlling the whole Middle East. And they get to Egypt and, Greece and the Balkans and Bulgaria. They're all controlled by the Ottomans. And they will remain there until, for 400 years, until the end of World War I, when they make the mistake of siding with the British, with the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans in World War I. And when they lose that war, the victorious Allied powers, primarily the French and the British. You should read about Sykes-Picot in 1916. Even when the war is going on, the British and the French are planning how they're going to create the modern Middle East. And that brings us, basically, that's setting the stage for what happened afterwards, because it's an outcome of Sykes-Picot, the Treaty of San Remo, which everyone should read about, which creates the mandates. The French are given basically what is Lebanon and Syria. They had some more territory, but the British forced them out of it. And the British are given primarily what is we call Palestine, Israel. They called it then Palestine because the British kept using the term that the Romans put into place. And Iraq and Jordan and all those countries. And these countries are all created basically primarily after World War II by the British and the French. But this is where, with the question you asked at the beginning, this is where that foreign nationalist concept comes into play in a very stupid way, by the way, because like you said, these are not people who think in terms of national identity. The Arab mind, and the Arab mind is the dominant culture of the Middle East for 1,300 years, is all about tribes and clans. And when the British come along, and what the British and the French, when they're dividing up the countries, they're not doing it based on profoundly deep understanding and concern for the delicate balance and the ethnicity and religious observance. And they're doing it for their own interests. Like oil is a huge one. The British fleet switches from coal to oil in World War I. So, the Hijaz, Saudi Arabia, that becomes really important stuff. Suez Canal, oh my God, that's huge for the British. They're a huge naval power. So they're making these countries like Iraq, which is part of what was Greater Syria back then. Let's take Sunnis and Shiites who themselves hate each other and split apart 1,000 years ago. And then let's take Kurds who broke away from Shiite Islam going back about 1,000 years ago. And let's stick them all in a country with some Yazidi and some, and some Druze who are all, these are all like offshoot groups of each other. And they're all fighting amongst each other. And they may all speak Arabic, which they do, Druze and Kurds, and actually Kurds have Kurdish language, excuse me, but they do speak, a lot of them speak Arabic. But the Druze and the Shiites and the Sunnis, and they all but they've created a nightmare in the Middle East. These countries only been able to.
It almost makes you wonder if they had a divide and conquer attitude still, even in that time, meaning they weren't necessarily going to rule over those places themselves, but in order to control that territory, they created a situation where it was just constant chaos. So they could just kind of do whatever they wanted in terms of getting their business needs met. Because it doesn't seem that they took into account what the people who are actually living there would have wanted in terms of dividing this land up into countries of people who like each other and want to live together in the same place. It seems they threw everybody together who are mortal enemies and said, okay, now you guys have to make it work.
Exactly. And not only that, they put a lot of it was payoff for World War One, the Arab arm, the Arabs that had helped the British. That's the whole story of Lawrence of Arabia and Ibn Saud and Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, and having to pay him off for losing Saudi Arabia. So they create two countries. One is called Iraq and one is called Transjordan. And they basically, they put their children in power, and they put King Farouk in Morocco. And by the way, all of these guys, because of the instability created, and that when these European powers leave, then these countries, the monarchies are deposed, basically. And like for instance, the country of Syria of today becomes an independent country, I believe, in like 1945. But by 1963, there's a Ba'ath Party coup. The Ba'aths are secular socialist Arab party that has a coup and takes over the country. And fast forward 7 years later, and Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, who just left like last week, he takes over the country, and he is a very brutal guy. He's going to rule from 1970 to, I think, 2000 is when he dies. Actually, Bashar al-Assad's older brother was supposed to take over for him because it's a dictatorship. And
Right.
but he's killed in a car accident. So Bashar, who just left, was actually trained to be an ophthalmologist. Maybe they thought maybe he was maybe he'd be a more normal guy. He just came. He turned out to be just as bad as his father,
Yeah,
but
it's
um,
horrific.
but also but also that for a short period of time, Egypt and Syria unite as a country. By the way, going in the 50s, they
Right,
make
which
the
is
unite
also
make
wild
the
to think about.
UAR, the
Strange.
United Arab Republic, which does not last very long at all. But it's an attempt to try and there's a whole pan-nationalist idea that totally flops, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is the leader of Egypt, who nationalized the Suez Canal and led the attempt to destroy Israel in the '67 war. But all the stuff you look at the pandemonium in the Middle East is created in what happened in Syria. So Syria, like Iraq, and like all these countries, like Libya, were controlled by dictators, and you had all and they were brutal in their oppression of different groups of people over whom they ruled. And we know that if we fast forward to the 10th year of the reign of Bashar al-Assad, the son who just was in power until recently, in 2010, starting in Tunisia, you had the Arab Spring, where it started in Tunisia, I believe, and it spread in a lot of Arab countries. The governments were overthrown in a lot of Arab states, and in 2011, a civil war broke out in Syria because all these ethnic minorities. You have to understand that the Assad family are not only Baathists, but they're Alawite, they're Alawi, and most of Syria is Islamic, but the vast majority are Sunni. And Alawi
So
are a
what is
splinter sect.
Alawi? How does that fit in? Is that a religious sect? Is it a cultural
Yeah,
sect? What does that mean?
it's an offshoot group. It's an offshoot of mainstream Sunni Islam. To be honest, I'm not super. I used to know a lot more about their theology, but they're a minority sect that
So
is
are
in
if we were
power.
to put it, say, like into Christian terms, would we say like it's the similarity of like they're Christian, but like these are Lutheran, these are Protestant, these are different sects of like a very all one umbrella would be Islam, but different parts that believe different parts of their theology. Is that a good
Yeah,
comparison?
basically. I mean, basically, you'd say like the big Christian way to divide up the world, keeping the Eastern Orthodox Church out of it. You'd say there's Catholics and Protestants, but then there's a lot of subgroups. So some of these groups split away completely. That is what Druze are, a breakaway from Shiite Islam going back about 1,000 years ago. Alawites are Muslims, but they have a slightly divergent view. I know Alawites, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, they don't have a prohibition against alcohol, so at least they can party more. I think they drink alcohol, but they have definite different theological beliefs, definite different theological beliefs. But in 2011, just to bring us up to the where we are now, just and then we're going to run out of time. But in 2011, the Syrian civil war started, and Syria was doing very, very badly. I remember saying this going back more than a decade ago. They're finished. It's a non-functional state. And by the way, Bashar al-Assad was absolutely brutal with his own people. I mean,
Yes,
he killed
horrific.
something like, he used chemical weapons on his own population. By the way, to go back a little earlier, in 2007, Israel took out Syria's nascent little nuclear program. They blew it up. They did it in 1981 to the Iraqi program, or Syriac. That was there because you can't let these countries have nuclear weapons, and they did it in 2007. And thank God the world should retroactively thank Israel for doing that, because you imagine these, countries that are like falling apart, these extremist groups getting a hold of
Well,
nuclear
and
bombs.
also
God
having
forbid.
a leader, a mad king leader like Bashar al-Assad, who literally chemical gassed his own people in the millions. Like, I mean, he just killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. It's just shocking.
And there's millions of people displaced in Syria, and millions left the country, primarily, by the way, which plays a part to Syria. Syria has like 3 million. I believe the country, I believe Syria's population is 25 million. And a majority of already between, it must be about 40% of the population is either living abroad, already fled the country to nearby locations, and some got all the way to Europe. And a lot of them are displaced within the country itself. But precisely when this Ba'athist regime that had been in place from basically 1970 until 2020, the end of 2024, 2011 was falling apart in steps. The powers from outside again, but some of them are close by for different reasons. The Iranians, who are trying to encircle Israel with different proxy countries that they can use to attack Israel from all sides. The Russians trying to reassert themselves back into the Middle East, which they had been thrown out of after the Cold War. And the Turks, who are trying to fight a Kurdish insurgency and also, reclaim territory they believe is historically theirs, and get rid of all of these, we can stop the refugee flow into their country. So now everyone's got their paws in Syria. But what the Iranians and the Russians were able to do is keep Syria from collapsing, because according to any normal laws of what would have happened in a military conflict, Syria would have fallen going back 13 years ago. And they've been propped up by Russia primarily, and Russia had this great dance with Israel where Israel was allowed to go in and blow stuff up on the border, because all the weapons, if you look at a map, that Lebanon is surrounded by Syria. And to get weapons from Iran, you have to go through Syria. So Israel's going in and blowing stuff up, and the Russian Air Force, which is flying overhead, has kind of had this tacit agreement to allow them to blow up certain things and not other things. But now, fast forward to what's happened just now, this is not really our topic, but if you look with Russia being bogged down in the war in Ukraine and having to borrow weapons from other people now, and being stretched very thin, and no longer having the massive population that it had like in the Napoleonic Wars or whenever in World War II. And with Iran really losing huge, with losing Hamas, losing Hezbollah, taking hits from Israel, this coalition of different people who, by the way, all hate each other, led by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, which is al-Golani, who is from the Golan Heights, I believe, originally, but raised in Saudi Arabia, I think, possibly. And then he was an Al-Qaeda guy, and now he claims to be reformed. But they led this wild coalition of people with Kurds in there who they can't stand each other. But it's the Middle East, my enemy's enemy's my friend.
Right.
So now we're kind of back to think about it. We ran through 3,500 years of history, or 4,000 years of history. Now we just have a mushmash of everyone in one giant mess.
I mean,
I'm laughing,
question
but it's
people
not
have
funny.
is like, okay, so who the heck is in there, and who's running this place, and who is this rebel group, and who's going to become the government, and what are we dealing with? Is what we're getting better than what was actually there before, or is it going to actually be even more problematic? When the Taliban took over and filled the vacuum in Afghanistan, and everyone's like, great, they have their own government now, and now basically they're passing laws that say not only can women never show their faces or their bodies in any way, they're not allowed to learn how to be nurses or doctors, and they're not allowed to have nurses or doctors. So there's an absolute gender apartheid now happening in Afghanistan. So my question is that also then what's coming for Syria? Like, is this really going to be better? So I think there's a lot to be happy about in terms of Israel being able to crush what's going on there. But at the same time, we have to ask the question, did we just cut off the head and get something worse?
But it often happens in short-term gains, long-term stupidity. The U.S. backed the Taliban against Russia, which drained Russia and really led largely to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But look what it created. The graveyard of empires is Afghanistan. No one's ever been able to conquer them. Israel even was into Hamas, helping them in originally in the Muslim Brotherhood as a counterforce to, the PLO. So you got to be careful. But we have to say with Syria, if you know the history of the relationship between Ba'athist run Syria, since Syria took part in the war of in the war of independence against Israel, and since then it's been involved itself in multiple wars in 1948, 1967, 1973. But what you can say about Syria is that that has been the quietest front. Now Israel has peace with Jordan today and Egypt, but it was always they maintained their ceasefire very, very well. And that has now been shattered since the Civil War. Things started to get unstable, and now they're very unstable. So you could say, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. And all the pundits are mentioning that quote because we don't know what is going to be. This guy Al Golani, the now reformed Al Qaeda guy, claims to be, but then you see these movies of these guys like cheering in Damascus saying, "We're coming for Israel next. We're going to come visit you." So the cows have fled the barn, and it's going to be very interesting to see what's going on. But again, you can rewind the whole thing and see what it goes back to, and see how many players over time have involved themselves in this conflict, which makes it that much harder to everyone who's playing in here. The U.S. is in here to a certain extent. After, I think the Turks are waiting for Trump to come in to remove the. America still has thousands of soldiers in Syria helping the Kurds, who, by the way, deserve a state. And one of the best things for the Middle East would be the poor Kurds who are supposed to get a state in the Treaty of Sèvres around the time of Sykes-Picot and during World War. At the end of World War I, we're supposed to get a state, and they really deserve it and didn't get it. And they would be a great stabilizing force, but I'm not sure that's ever going to happen. So we got a bit of a mess here, but this is just the end of a very long story that a lot of people have put their fingers into the pie in the last many thousands of years. And I guess we'll have a lot to talk about in the next. It's going to be happening fast. A lot of stuff is going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an understatement. Yeah, for sure. Amazing. Okay. Wow. Like you said, you took us through a few thousand years of history in a very short period of time. So, but I think the arc of the narrative here is so important because, like you said, like you don't understand always what's going on now if you don't understand the history of where it came from. It reminds me a little bit of the idea today in terms of intergenerational trauma. Like if you won't understand your behavior now if you don't understand all the people that you came from and what they kind of contributed to how you deal with life. So I think we're looking at the historical, intergenerational trauma of the region to try to understand what's going on, and the idea that we can relate to Syria as a normal country in the way that we think about a country in the West is not going to help us understand how monumental it is in terms of what's happening there right now. So super, super helpful.
Right. And superimposing Western solutions on Eastern problems is not going to work either.
Right.
So it's going to involve some creative thinking, but a lot's going to depend on who emerges strongest here. And after January 20th, when Trump comes into office, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens until then and right after then. So hang on to your hats.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
All right. God willing, we'll be safe. God willing, some kind of peace will emerge. All right. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please let us remind you to share, subscribe, rate, or review the podcast. And if you would like to see us having this conversation, you can find us on YouTube on Rabbi Ken Spiro's YouTube channel. If you could subscribe there and also leave a comment, that would be great. If you have ideas for topics or things you'd like us to speak about, please get in touch. We always love hearing from you. The information is in liner notes. And if you would like to bring us to your city to do a live recording of our podcast, we are happy to oblige. It's a lot of fun having conversations when there are other people in the room too. All right. Ken, did I forget anything?
No, I think you got it. You mentioned the YouTube channel.
Yep.
Okay, you got everything then. Great. Thank you so much, Ellie, for making it all happen.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. And God willing, we'll see you soon.